So at the beginning of the New Testament, we have these four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and each one of them gives us an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus, the Son of God. And each account is teeming with interactions people had with Jesus. And we're spending some time over these Sundays just looking at some of these encounters that people had with him. If Jesus is the Son of God, if he is God come to earth, which as Christians we believe he is, then who he spent time with and how he spoke to people and the kind of attention he gave people increases our understanding of what God is like. Yeah, and that's the goal, right? I mean that's why we're here. To worship him, but also to get to know him. I've been a Christian 20 years, and for all of that time, I've been reading the Bible, and my aim for reading it is because I want to get to know him more. And the more I read it, the more I get to know what he's like. That's the aim, right? That's our goal, is to increase our understanding and our knowledge of what he's like. Maybe you're not a Christian here this morning, but there's something. You're here because you want to know, well, if there is a God, then what's he like? And this morning we're going to be looking in Luke's Gospel at an encounter that someone had with Jesus that increases our ability to see, well, what is God like through this encounter? You can find it in Luke's Gospel, chapter 5. If you've got a Bible, you can turn to it, but the words are going to come up on the screen. And it says this: while Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." We'll look at Jesus' response in a moment, but whenever you kind of read the Bible, we're reading about a time and a culture that is very different from our own. Leprosy is not something that we're particularly familiar with living in, Mid-Sussex in the 21st century. And so to kind of understand the significance of this story, we need to try and get our heads around the time and the culture that they were living in. Leprosy was, and still is actually in some parts of the world, a horrendous disease. A horrendous disease on many different levels. The condition rendered the body a mass of kind of ulcers and decaying flesh. Fingers would begin to curl. Blotches of skin would discolor and start to smell pretty rancid. Nerve endings would numb, leading to the loss of fingers and toes, even feet and hands. It's a disease that's sometimes been described as death by inches. And the social consequences were almost as severe as the physical ones. You might be living a normal life in your community. You've got a family, you've got children, you've got a job. Maybe you're a farmer. A lot of these places were agricultural communities. And you're out in the fields one day and you just suddenly notice that you've just begun to lose the feelings in the tops of your fingers. You don't really think anything about it, but it doesn't get better. In fact, it gets worse. And all of a sudden you can't feel your hands anymore. You pick up tools, but it's just like they're looking at foreign objects. And then one day you might come in from a day in the field and you're washing your hands in the bucket and you just notice there's blood in the bucket. And you don't know where it's come from, and you just kind of look around and you notice that you've got a gash right across your hand that you haven't even noticed because you can't feel your hands. And blotches start appearing on your skin. And at that point, what you would do is you would leave your family and you would go and see the priest. And the priest would look at you without touching you and would say this word, unclean. And with a single word, your whole life would just come crashing down around you. This wasn't just a kind of statement about your physical appearance. It was a judgment about your spiritual condition. To be unclean was to not be allowed to be in a place of worship. You couldn't go to the synagogue. You couldn't go to the temple and sing praises to God. You couldn't go and listen to the rabbi read the scriptures. You couldn't go and sacrifice offerings for your forgiveness anymore. As a leper, you were literally cut off from community, but you were also alienated from God relationally. And according to the Jewish laws, what your future would look like from now on as a leper would be this. It states it in Leviticus chapter 13, verse 45. It says, anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face, and cry out, unclean, unclean. And as long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside of the camp, which was to say, outside of community, away from friends and family, away from your children, in complete isolation. You'd have to go and live in a leper colony outside of town. No one would ever come and visit you in that leper colony. You know, if you're lucky, your family might drop off a food parcel at the edge of the encampment, but for most lepers, a time would come when your family would stop visiting to do that. Such was the stigma attached to the disease. And you would be left with just trying to beg in order to live, in order to have some food. And the purpose of wearing torn clothes and having unkempt hair is that if you did go into town, people would know you were a leper and therefore they could avoid you. You know, some sources say that lepers also had to wear bells around their necks so people could hear you coming. You know, other historical documents suggest that it was illegal to greet a leper, that you had to remain 100 cubits in distance from anyone else. That's the equivalent of 183 meters today. Such was the fear of catching the disease. You know, Josephus, he's this kind of Jewish historian living around a sort of same time as Jesus, he once wrote this: lepers were treated as if they were dead men. You know, it was said that next to touching a dead body, getting near to a leper was the rankest form of defilement. So no one ever welcomed you. No one ever greeted you. No one ever smiled at you. No one ever waved at you. No one ever touched you. No one ever loved you. Can you imagine living like that? I mean, can you imagine the humiliation? Walking down Hayward's Heath High Street shouting, unclean, unclean. In other words, don't come near me, avoid me. I'm socially, I'm spiritually, I'm physically unclean. I'm like a dead man. You know, it's impossible to imagine the sense of worthlessness and despair that you would feel. Well, that's the condition that the man had that comes before Jesus. And it says that he was covered with leprosy. You know, we're not talking about someone who was at the beginning stages with a couple of spots on his skin. Now, he's absolutely riddled with the disease. In other words, he's been living with this condition in isolation without any physical contact with another human being for years and years and years. And he knows the rules that, you know, not coming near people in public. He knows it's dangerous. If you come near someone, then it's likely that you would have rocks thrown at you. It's dangerous, but he comes right up close to Jesus anyway. Why? Because he's desperate. He's past worrying about what people think of him. He's fully aware of the extent of his condition. He knows that he's hopeless, that there's nothing he can do to help himself. He knows that no one else can help him either. All of his friends and his families, his community have left him. He knows that he's as good as a dead man walking. But word had clearly reached the leper colony that there's a man named Jesus who's going around healing people. And so in complete desperation, he comes. And do you notice how he comes? It says in the verse, it says, when he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground. You know, the Greek phrase which is used here, and this passage originally was written in Greek. It says to lay prostrate and kiss the earth. You know, that's the position that you would take in front of a God. And this man is coming before Jesus, laying down, worshipping him as if he is God, with his face to the ground. He's coming in reverence and awe, acknowledging that Jesus is his only hope, the only possible source of his healing, because he's God. And when lying down on the ground, he says in a kind of hoarse voice that would have been typical of people with kind of an advanced stage of leprosy, he says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." In fact, the way that this phrase is written suggests that he repeated it over and over again. And so he's lying with his face in the dirt repeatedly in desperation, saying, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Lord." He comes in desperation, but he also comes full of humility. Lord, if you are willing. He doesn't, come pushing past the crowds, demanding that Jesus heal him. He doesn't kind of launch into a spiel about how unfair life has been to him. He doesn't deserve what's happened to him. He should be healed. He comes full of humility. I know often in my own life when I approach God, I come before him like in prayer, bow down in worship. But it's not long actually until I'm lifting myself up and in arrogance saying, "Lord, you need to do this for me. Lord, you need to fix this situation. Lord, this thing's happened to me and it's totally unfair. You need to do this." But I so often lack the humility that we see in this situation. Lord, if you're willing, he says. I know I'm not in a position to demand from you. God, I'm not making any presumptions about what you should do. But Lord, if you are willing. He comes full of humility, but he also comes full of faith. He says, "Lord, you can make me heal, make me clean." Notice he doesn't say, "Lord, you can heal me." Sure, he wants his leprosy gone, but to be clean was to leave a life of isolation, to be back into community. More than that, to be clean was to be able to go to the synagogue again, to hear the scriptures read again, to offer sacrifices of praise to God again with other people. And that's his ultimate desire of this man, is to be made clean and therefore acceptable, to be back in a place to worship God. The priest couldn't do that for him. His friends and his family, his communities, his culture couldn't do that for him. But he's in absolutely no doubt that Jesus has the ability to transform his situation. His life might appear hopeless, but he comes full of faith that despite everything he's experiencing in life, he is not too far gone to be made clean by Jesus. And so looking down at his feet, Jesus has this man kind of lying on the ground in front of him in desperation. This social outcast who in reverence and humility is saying, "Lord, I'm full of faith. You can, if you are willing, make me clean." What is Jesus' response to this man? Whatever his response is going to be, is going to tell us something about what the character of God is like. And Luke records this. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. He grabbed hold of him. "I am willing," he says. "Be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. Jesus then ordered him, "Don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priests, and offer sacrifices that Moses commanded for you for your cleansing as a testimony for them." What you discover in Jesus' response to this man is this. The miracle shows his power, but the touch reveals his love. Do you see that? The miracle shows his power. Be clean, he says, and immediately the leprosy leaves him. And the infectious disease is like banished with just 2 words. Be clean. Rotting skin becomes, smooth and healthy again. Ulcers just drop off him. Fingers begin to uncurl, even regrow. His contorted frame begins to stretch out again, and fresh air fills his lungs. What these people are witnessing is absolutely incredible. In front of their very eyes, something that has never happened before is happening. As they see a man who, is considered as good as dead becomes fully alive again. The miracle reveals Jesus' power. But the touch, the touch reveals his love. Jesus didn't need to touch him in order to heal him. He could have kept his distance and just said from 183 meters away, be clean. But he chose to touch the man. The word here in the Greek actually means to fasten onto. So this wasn't a kind of like, Jesus got some, sterile gloves on and just lightly touched him. No, this is I'm going to grab hold of you so that you know that I've got you. And yes, I'm willing. Be clean. And when Jesus reached out and grabbed hold of him, what you learn about Jesus, and therefore what you learn about the character of God, is that he is full of compassion. The miracle showed his power, but the touch reveals his heart for the leper, for the outcast, for the man who is desperate about his condition. His touch reveals his heart for the poor, for the broken, for the meek, for the forgotten. You got to understand that this man was physically unclean. For Jesus to grab hold of him was against anything that the culture said he should do. The man had a life sentence of never, ever being in contact with any human being again. He hasn't felt the touch of anyone for years and years and years. No handshakes, no high fives, no hugs, no kisses, nothing. Mother Teresa, who was living in the slums of Calcutta, she once said this: the biggest disease of today is not leprosy or tuberculosis, but rather the feeling of being unwanted, uncared for, and deserted by everyone. And Jesus knew this. He knew that as well as physically dying, this man was emotionally and spiritually dying. And more than anything, what he needed was not just to be healed by a word from Jesus' lips, but to have his loneliness and his isolation dealt with by a touch from his hands. In this man's encounter with Jesus, what we discover is that he is the Lord of the desperate. He's the God of the hopeless. For those society has rejected, he comes to embrace. He comes to grab hold of the unwanted and the deserted. It's the touch that transforms this man's life, because it's the touch that communicates value and worth and dignity and acceptance. The leper hadn't experienced it in years and years, and Jesus reached out and touches him. And I don't think we can kind of adequately describe the profound feeling of joy that would have coursed through this man's body. Onlookers would have been shocked. His disciples would have been shocked. Jesus is now ceremonially unclean. He can't go to the synagogue anymore. He's got to isolate himself because he's touched a leper. But the leper for the first time in years, well, he feels loved. Jesus once said this: I've not come for the healthy, but I've come for the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. And right here is an example of what Jesus meant by that. God does not reach out and touch the self-sufficient. Those who kind of think they don't need any help, that they'll be all right on their own, they'll make it into heaven one day on their own merit. He comes for those that know that they are in desperate need, that their condition is terminal, aware of their condition, like the man in this story. People who know their lack of ability to do anything about it. People who recognize their complete need of Jesus to make them clean again. If you come to Jesus and you say, I'm 25%, unclean, but for the most part, I'm kind of okay. I'm pretty acceptable for the most part, but there's a little bit of me that's a little bit unclean. I recognize that. Then he won't reach out to you and touch you. He's after people that come with reverence and bow down before him, submitting to him as the only source of their spiritual healing. One writer, he put it like this. He said, Jesus' touch does not come in response to a casual, irreverent acknowledgement of who he is. It comes as we bow down before him in the realization that he is our only hope. That's how this man in this story approached Jesus, and that's why Jesus grabbed hold of him. How about you? I believe there's some people here that God wants to grab hold of, to transform your life and make you whole and clean again. Well, that's what he's come to do. You may not be a leper. In fact, you're probably not a leper if you're here, but if you're honest, you know what it is to feel excluded, unloved, isolated. You know what it feels to feel worthless and living without hope. Well, Jesus has come to reach out to you. But before you can know the loving touch, he's waiting until you recognize the desperate condition that you're in. He's waiting until you bow down to worship him as the only one that can make you fully alive. In humility, without demanding anything, he's waiting for us to say, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. You can change my life. And if you're willing to approach him in that way, I believe that you will feel the touch and hear the words, I am willing. Because that's what Jesus has come to do. He's come to grab hold of us firmly so that we're in absolutely no doubt that he's got us. And if that's you, I'd love to pray for you in a minute. I believe that you will know the touch of God in your life. It's an interesting thing. We're going to close in a second, but it's an interesting, I've been reflecting, I've been reading this story this week. I've been reflecting on my own life, And 20 years ago, I became a Christian, and as I encountered God in an incredible way. I wasn't a leper, but I was living with a long-term physical condition called colitis. And it was pretty grim, In actual fact, very uncomfortable at times, debilitating at times. And the day I gave my life to Jesus, instantly I was healed of it, of this physical condition. That the miracle revealed his power. But what I've been reflecting on this week is that over the years, I often forget what happened to me, which is strange, right? Because I had this condition and I have been supernaturally healed of something. I don't have it anymore. One moment I had it, the next I didn't. One moment I'm on a lot of medication, the next I'm off it. Doctors can't explain what happened to me. It's this miracle that's happened to me. Jesus demonstrated his power in that. But the weird thing is that often I forget that that's part of my story, that that's what happened to me. But what I've been reflecting on this week is what I never forget. What I'm reminded about pretty much every single day. Why I'm here worshiping God. What is always I'm conscious of is the fact that he grabbed hold of me. Sometimes I forget about his power, but I never have ever forgotten about his touch. The fact that he grabbed hold of my life, because it's his touch that revealed his absolute love for me. The Apostle Paul, he put it like this: as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, has made us alive in Christ. The man in this story who met Jesus felt his touch of incredible love. I have felt God's touch and his incredible love. And you know what? You can feel it too.